Welcome to the Awakening Podcast. You can find all our episodes on awakeningpodcast.org. We're also on the YouTube and Rumble, and you'll find the links in the bio.link/podcast. I'm also a podcasting coach with 4 other podcasts, the meditation, speaking, the crypto, and the learn Polish, and you'll find them on the same link. My guest today, looking forward to this one. He's serial entrepreneur, he's an author, and he's the CEO of a few companies, but Zona Health. Please welcome to the show, Mark Young.
Thank you, Roy. I certainly appreciate that intro.
So I always like the guest to kind of give us a bit more details. You might let listeners know a little bit more about who's Mark.
Sure. So thank you for having me here today, Roy. So obviously I am Mark, and you've given some of my highlights here, but I am the CEO at Zona Health, and Zona Health is it's a company dedicated towards natural health. And this is why I think this is like a perfect fit for your audience, because your entire mantra behind your podcast is getting people information that may be little known. And I would say that sometimes we have to organically shout messages of goodwill and messages of truth above the media noise and above the crowd. And often that's where the best nuggets in life are found, right? It's that there's amazing things available, but you got to dig a little deeper for them, because that's not what the world puts out there for you to find. And Zona fits that mold, and that is Zona is actually a company dedicated towards natural health through natural means and non-pharmacological solutions. And again, not that we're anti-pharma, but we do believe that the body has the ability to heal itself and to keep itself alive if given the right circumstances. If given the right environment, the body finds ways to heal. It's an incredible organism. And what happens is environmental toxins and stimulants that happen in the world and all of these things, they cause the body to decay over time. And obviously that's the aging process. We specifically focus on cardiovascular health. And cardiovascular health is obviously important. A large percentage of the population, meaning an entire third of the world, suffers from what we call hypertension, which is an elevated blood pressure. And our belief is that the body has the ability to actually control its own blood pressure, because when you're in your youth, you don't have these problems by and large, right? Young people don't typically suffer with high blood pressure. Why is that? So something happens in the aging process that causes this to happen. And we believe that we have a medical device that actually resolves this issue for most people without pharmacology's involvement in that conversation. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, pharmacology has a strong hold on the world. That is the loudest voice in the room. So we talk with people like you and your audience to talk to them about how there are ways to fix these problems without taking meds. And that is my mantra. Information about me, and that is I am a natural health freak. I am a science geek. And I want to learn everything there is, because I find the human body and physiology absolutely fascinating. I know you'd mentioned a moment ago that you were listening to an episode where I was a guest on Dave Asprey's podcast. And very true, that those are my people.
And that, just for those that wouldn't know Dave Asprey, he's made that his life study. And then he's bringing on international guests it's really for his own information to learn, but the listeners are actually benefiting from the conversation.
Absolutely. And that's my belief, right? And that is Dave Asprey is, he calls himself the father of biohacking. And biohacking literally just being a word that he's coined to talk about. He actually was a computer programmer and used to do software hacking. And that's the story behind biohacking, is he figured out, well, wait, I can be a computer hacker by changing some code. And by changing some code in the software, I'm able to get an entirely different output out of this program. And he's like, well, I wonder if I could change some lines of code in my physiology that would give me a greater output physiologically by changing some lines of code. And that's what he started to do, is experimenting on himself. And then ultimately coming up with Bulletproof Coffee and all of those types of things. And now his entire brand is built around finding ways to improve life, better living through science, really. But science being organic and natural science, not necessarily, like I said, pharmacology and surgical options and all this else. And I personally believe our medical system here in the U.S. is a bit upside down, but I won't get into those details.
I think it's international. Like it happens first in America. You kind of have the cold, you sneeze, and it comes across to the rest of the world. But no, it's the same everywhere. And I
gotta be honest with you. I agree with you on most of that. The part where I disagree is I think that the U.S. has actually hung on to a healthcare system. The rest that we've actually hung on to more of a patient-centric healthcare system far beyond what the rest of the world does, because so much of the world has gone to socialized medicine, and that kind of top-down approach. And the U.S. has actually held strongly to the patient-centric, and I think we're creeping in that direction. But in that respect, I actually like the U.S. more than others. I mean, we juxtapose ourselves frequently to Canada. And Canadian friends and family of mine are like, you might as well just die here, right? Because the healthcare system has zero interest in keeping you alive. And every time you go, and I have a friend of mine who's needed a hip replacement for 4 years and can't even get an appointment because they've just determined it's not that important. So it has nothing to do with your need or your pain or your anything. It's they decide who's next in line based on what they find to be most important in the healthcare system. Like, it's terrible. And what's interesting to me is that those are friends of mine. They live in the British Columbia area, and they're literally looking to move to the US, but that's what got them involved in the biohacking space, because they figured the traditional medical system is completely letting them down. So they started exploring into other areas of how could they take care of their own health using non-pharmacological means, because in order to get pharma, they have to go through the medical system. So they started using a lot of natural solutions, which is how I met them. So it's just interesting to see that people are taking this back into their own hands, and that's what I love.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's in the last few years, a lot of people stop trusting the white coats. It's not that if we get hit by a bus in the morning, you don't want someone doing acupuncture or a chiropractic. There's times
we the ER.
Yeah, exactly, we need it. But I think with food and everything, we have to take full control ourselves.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Roy, not to be political, but the last few years since COVID, I have, my ear is very close to the ground on this topic because working in the natural health space. But one of the things that we've noticed, and I say this anecdotally, is that the COVID pandemic has caused an international distrust for the medical system. And people, for whatever reason, are able to look at things that weren't the way that they were told they were. People, for possibly very good reasons, believed things that hadn't been properly vetted. And in that respect, what's happened is people have realized that my health is my responsibility. My health is nobody else's responsibility. And the decisions that are made for my health need to be made by me. And I'm going to have to do some research, and I'm going to have to learn more about myself and my own physiology and my health and what am I taking in. And in that respect, I believe it's a great awakening for the healthcare system, because there is, for whatever reason, there is a pervasive skepticism around traditional healthcare at this point. And I think that's good, because the scientific method itself is meant to be questioned. Science itself is test retest. And there's no time in history that science has ever been, this is what it is, now shut up and believe me. Science is meant to be questioned. And in that respect, I'm glad to see that people are finally embracing that and not just accepting what they're.
And just on, because I told you prior to recording that I'm Irish, and I've got a good friend, top consultant in a private hospital. And when I was writing a book, I was asking about, the kickbacks, which company do. They're all based in Ireland, all the big pharmaceuticals, because of the tax haven. There's a kind of loophole. They don't pay anything. It's like everybody else does, but they don't. And she said every one of them do a kickback. So there's a conflict of interest there straight away. Plus, they have no liability. So when you're bringing something to the table that actually takes away these meds from people and helps them to get healthy naturally, it's welcomed in this world.
It's sad. So that's my take on it anyways, is that I want to see the world a healthier place, but I want to see people empowered to make their own decisions. And they can make whichever decision they like. But respect to Zona Health, we are here to try to help solve cardiovascular health. And we have a means to do it that has been tested and retested. And we're excited that the option is available to people who are looking for non-pharmacological solutions. And of course, we always tell people to consult with their physicians because doctors are still doctors. Talk about a distrust for healthcare systems, but doctors are very well-educated people. To their knowledge as well.
So you might let the listeners know, what exactly is it?
Oh, yeah. So the Zona Plus is actually a device that is created by Zona Health. So the Zona Plus is what I'm talking about. And people can check it out online. If you're listening and you want to go look online while we're talking, it's zona.com, zona.com. And the Zona Plus is actually, it's a medical device that uses the science of isometric hand grip therapy. And isometric meaning the Greek words for equal measurement, right? So isometrics, think of it this way. When we talk isometrics, we talk about the difference between, for instance, a sit-up and a plank, right? So a sit-up uses concentric and eccentric motion. So I'm curling up, tightening my abdominal muscles, and then I'm expanding them by letting them relax and go down. Isometric means that you're holding a muscle group at exactly the same measurement over a period of time, much like you would hold a plank. So that's the example that I give for people understanding isometrics. That is, a plank is only good when it is done at the exact measurement. So I see people at the gym and they're fidgeting around in their plank and they're popping their butt in the air. And I'm like, well, that's nice, but it's not isometric, right? Because you're moving around the entire time. You got to stay still for a plank to be effective. So many years ago, a doctor by the name of Ronald Wiley was hired by the U.S. Air Force to conduct a study on why pilots go into what's called G-force blackout. So what happens is when a pilot goes into, and if you've seen the Top Gun movie, you'll know what I'm talking about, and that is that when they go too fast, they pass out. Tom Cruise is telling him, like, you need to make sure that, you got to keep your wits about you. And, you've got to make sure that you don't pass out when you get into those high speeds. Well, that was the study that Ronald Wiley was conducting with the U.S. Air Force, is how do they avoid G-force blackout? Interestingly enough, and somewhat serendipitously, what he found was that as pilots were involved in this study, the data at the end of the study showed that all of their blood pressure went down. And he's like, well, that wasn't what we were studying, but what happened here? So he took all of the data, put it aside, continued his study on G-force blackout. And when that study was over, he ended up going back to that data and saying, this is too interesting. I need to get back on board. So he went through the data, and what he found was the grip that the pilot held on the joystick actually affected blood pressure. So he started dissecting that data to find out what was going on. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that when a pilot is holding on to the joystick of the aircraft, they're squeezing it, and the faster the plane went, the tighter they squeezed that joystick to hold on to it. That's an isometric grip. They're holding it for a duration of time at the exact same grip strength or a slightly increasing strength over time. And he's like, well, that's lowering blood pressure. That's the connection. That's so weird. So he started postulating that using different grip strengths over different periods of times and so on would end up reducing blood pressure by simply using grip strength. years later, he ended up coming up with an algorithm, and the algorithm is still the algorithm we use today. Strangely, probably 15 years later, we're still using the exact same algorithm because it's proven to be the most effective. And that is by having people hold the Zona Plus, which is a hand grip device. I don't have mine on me. How terrible. By having people hold this hand grip device, what they're able to do is hold it at a static grip, and the device gives biofeedback telling you if you're squeezing it too much or squeezing it too little. It gives audio signals to make sure that you're holding it exactly in range. And for 2 minutes, you hold this device at the exact same grip strength. Now, physiologically, let me explain, because that makes no sense to people. Like, oh, I just hold this and my blood pressure goes down. What is it doing to me? So I want to unpack that a little bit for the scientist among you. Um, Zona Plus for the lay person, yes, you squeeze this device, you take a break, you switch hands, you squeeze it on the other hand, you change grips, and then you do that 2 times. That's really what happens. So you really don't have to understand the science to get the result. And what it does every time you use it, it calibrates to your grip strength. So it doesn't matter how strong you are, if you're having a bad day or if you didn't sleep last night, it calibrates to today's momentum. Now, scientifically, I want to unpack this for the people amongst your audience who love the craziness of science, because that's where I end up falling. I'm like, wow, this is really interesting, but I need to understand it more deeply. So when you hold your muscle at a static grip, imagine that you're doing a squat and you hold down and you never come back up, right? You go halfway down into a squat and you just hold it. That's going to hurt pretty quickly, right? You can imagine what that feels like on your quads right now.
I can feel it burning you just telling me about it.
Exactly, right? I go down into my squat and I just hold it. I don't come back up. And that starts to hurt. Same with a plank, right? Everybody can do the first 20, 30 seconds of a plank, no big deal. Once you get past that 30-second mark, you're like, okay, this isn't fun anymore. You get past the 60 seconds and suddenly it starts hurting. Well, there's a reason for that. Now, part of it is that the reason for that is that your muscle actually contains a certain amount of sodium. And that sodium level in the muscle, which we refer to, it's often found, and we refer to it similarly to electrolytes. So we'll go into that. So it's the level of water retention that the muscle is able to maintain. What happens is as you go into that static hold for the first 30 seconds, 60 seconds for most people, that's usually the range, your muscle is able to hold that just fine. It's not a big deal. You're just holding it there. What happens is after that time, you end up needing additional sodium in the muscle for the muscle not to cramp. Right. So when you're sodium deficient, you end up cramping more often, right? Mineral deficient, electrolyte deficient, you end up cramping, which is why we're during heavy bouts of exercise. You want to make sure that you're hydrating, but not just hydrating with water, because water doesn't increase sodium or electrolyte efficiency. So what happens over that time is that that particular muscle group begins to get sodium deficient, and the body must force sodium into the muscle. Anyone who knows anything about cellular biology knows that sodium and potassium must stay at an absolute balance in all cells. So if sodium is leaving a cell, potassium must also leave a cell. As potassium leaves a cell, it's just a byproduct of the sodium leaving. So it's a coincidence that potassium is leaving the cell, because that's not what muscle is trying to do. Potassium leaves the cell, and then it ends up pushing through what's called the endothelium. Now, the endothelium in the cardiovascular system is actually the lining of your blood vessels. So as the cells are releasing potassium, it's passing through the endothelium. And as it passes through the endothelium, potassium is the only substance that softens an endothelium. Now, put a pin in that, and I want to go backwards from it. When a person suffers from high blood pressure, what that means is that there's a constriction in the blood vessel that's causing the pressure buildup. Imagine like a kink in a garden hose, right? If the garden hose is somehow restricted, the pressure builds up. And then if that kink gets released, what happens? You get a big gush of water out the other end of the garden hose. Same thing happens with your cardiovascular system. What we're looking to do is to take that blood vessel and expanded, because the more expanded or relaxed or dilated, all of these words matter, the more dilated a blood vessel, the lower the pressure. Lower the pressure, the easier it is for the heart to actually pump blood throughout the entire body. When a body does not maintain a regulated blood pressure, that's caused because of a hardening in the endothelium. Now, the endothelium, we call that arteriosclerosis. Okay, that's a hardening of the arteries, that over time, there is a sclerosis that's happening in an arterial level. And arteriosclerosis is a hardening of the blood vessels, which ultimately is happening at the endothelial level. The endothelium, however, is actually the thermostat, if you will, of the body. It is what regulates blood pressure. So imagine this: the endothelium is the trigger that tells the body that it needs to relax. But as the endothelium ages, it begins to harden. It's like a sponge that begins to dry. So that sponge dries out and it loses its ability to tell the body that the blood pressure is high. It's like the thermostat shut off, right? The furnace is turned off because the thermostat doesn't know that it should be turned back on. So the endothelium doesn't realize that your blood pressure is high. And because of that, it does nothing to correct it. So it's as if the body doesn't know it's in danger. So it just turns off that feature, and then your blood pressure rises. The endothelium begins to constrict, it hardens over time, and the harder it gets, the higher the blood pressure goes, simply because you don't have the ability to regulate that anymore because you've lost your regulator. Back to our potassium conversation. Potassium is the only substance known to soften the endothelium. So as I'm doing my muscle restriction, which pushes sodium out of the cell, potassium is also leaving the cell. As potassium is leaving the cell, it's passing through the endothelium. The endothelium is softening. And as the endothelium softens, it's as if that light bulb turns on. And the body goes, oh my gosh, our blood pressure is high. We didn't know that. We need to fix this. So the potassium passes through, the endothelium softens, that regulator turns back on, and your body begins to control its own blood pressure the way it always should have. So really what we're doing is you've got two different systems, one being the cardiovascular system and one being the muscular system. And we're able to hack into the muscular system to cause an effect on the cardiovascular system. And it's only because of that sodium-potassium connection at a cellular level. So we're able to, and again, I use that word hack, that Dave Asprey biohacking. I'm able to hack my own biology because I can twist this knob over here and it causes this change over here. And that's what's fascinating about this, is that people think hand grip exercise, isometrics, what in the world does that have to do with blood pressure? Well, the reality is it doesn't. Those things are only connected because of the strange little cellular connection of potassium and sodium balance. And because of that, if I push one thing out, the next thing moves with it. And it's almost as if you see that cantilever kind of reaction. When one side moves, the other side has to move with it. And because of that, I'm able to get an output on both sides. And that's the fascinating part about the body.
And
yeah.
For those, because we've all got readings of a blood pressure, could you explain the two numbers that we get and what they mean so people understand it?
Sure. So blood pressure itself, people actually look into blood pressure, and we're all familiar. The American Heart Association has recently changed some of those measurements on us. So blood pressure should be, nowadays, they're saying the proper blood pressure should be about 110/72. And 110/72, 110 being that top number, is referred to as your systolic blood pressure. And systolic blood pressure actually measures the pressure in the arteries every time the heart beats. The diastolic blood pressure, which is the low number, actually measures the pressure in the arteries when the heart is at rest. So you're looking at when it's beating and when it's not, is in essence those two things. Now, interestingly, scientifically, systolic blood pressure is actually much more responsive to what I refer to as circumstantial input. So, for instance, bad day at work, going through a divorce, just had a car almost sideswipe me on the highway. Systolic blood pressure will rise. Diastolic blood pressure doesn't typically rise in those circumstances, meaning that diastolic blood pressure is actually a better measurement of overall health than systolic. But strangely, most people have a tendency to look at the systolic number and decide whether or not they're healthy or not. American Heart Association now, they used to say 120 over 80 was the perfect blood pressure. That has gone away. They're now saying 110 over 72. I tend to believe that 110 over 72 is a better blood pressure reading. I agree with that. I disagree with the reasoning because they all of a sudden just changed it 1 November as if all human bodies changed simultaneously. But they changed it November of 2021, I believe it was. And when they changed it, they unilaterally just said, you know what, we've decided that this is a more ideal blood pressure. And now all of the levels of pre-hypertension, stage 1 hypertension, stage 2, all of them went down by 10 points. The skeptic in me is going to say, suddenly, standard of care just pushed an entire group of 10 points of systolic blood pressure into the requirement of being on more medication. So I'm going to skeptically say that you literally just took a huge portion of the population and told them that they are mandatorily medicated.
And just on
And
that,
what I find,
because with, like, say, the testing of that, when they want to get people on meds, because I remember when I was living in Ireland, went to this clinic and they were trying to get me on blood pressure tablets, and I was like, no, I'm not having this. But they just tested me once, and my friend who I'd mentioned earlier, she said you should be tested 3 times, because you said you could be in a car accident, you could be going through a divorce or anything like that, and to get an accurate reading they should do it a few times, and they don't. And I found out later that they're well known for actually pushing this, and unfortunately the industry seems to be doing that, getting people that really don't need it.
well, and the other side to that, Roy, is that not only are doctors pushing it, but part of the reason why doctors are pushing it, and again, I'll speak to the American medical system, part of the reason why they're pushing it is simply because there is a what we refer to as standard of care. And that is, if you showed up at the doctor's office and your blood pressure was elevated into the type 1 or stage 1, stage 2 hypertension region, if that's the case and you were actually use the word diagnosed, because if a doctor sees it and says it, that's a diagnosis now. If you were diagnosed with high blood pressure, the problem is that it is legally the doctor's responsibility to prescribe you. Standard of care says if a person has blood pressure greater than 130 systolic or greater than 80 diastolic, you must prescribe. And if they don't recommend that you get a blood pressure med, even a low dosage, then they could be sued if something were to happen to you. Because standard of care says that when a person shows up with high blood pressure, you must bring it down. Now, if you told the doctor, no, thank you, I'm not interested, I'm actually going to go, do whatever, you can do that. You can absolutely do that. The interesting thing is that most people's answer to how they're going to fix blood pressure themselves is reducing sodium intake. As we just discussed a moment ago, actually, sodium is in fact the system that's going to help fix the problem. But most people are like, oh, I'm going to eat a low sodium diet. That'll actually fix my blood pressure. It's like, no, that actually throws off your potassium balance, but that's okay. But nevertheless, doctors are legally required to prescribe, which means this is no longer even about kickbacks from the pharmaceutical industry. This is the government making them legally required to prescribe medications. And I'm going to go a step further to the science nerds in the group here. one of my biggest problems with pharmaceuticals, and that is, again, you and I discussed offline, like if I get hit by a bus on the way to work, please take me to the hospital, right? Like I want to be at the hospital surrounded by medical professionals if I just got hit by a bus. I'm not dissing the medical profession. What I'm saying in it is that, as an example, pharmaceuticals, there's about 1 million different types of proteins in the body. Right? That's the different types of proteins that exist. And proteins are structures that are formed by amino acids, and they form in all different shapes, and then they fold and they unfold. And as they do such, they perform some kind of activity. But proteins run my cardiovascular system. They run my metabolic system. They run my brain. Everything is run by a protein. The problem is that we have only scientifically named about 5% of the types of proteins in the body. We only know the shapes and names of about 5% of those proteins. That's all we've discovered so far, right? We're new to protein science, as it turns out. Here's the problem. When pharmaceuticals are created, what they're net in effect doing is that they're only trying to trigger a specific protein to do a very specific thing. So you find the protein that actually triggers cardiovascular reduction, or blood pressure reduction. You find that protein, you find a medication that is able to move it. The problem is you have no idea how that particular medication is affecting the 95% of protein-based systems that we've not even discovered yet. And then you end up with these disclaimers like side effects may include. Well, they may include because this medication, you've figured out a way that it triggers one thing, but you have no idea what it's doing across this vast sea of other systems that have never been tested with it. We don't even know what those proteins are. So what's happening is we get this medication that is very acute in its work, but it's having all of this avalanche of unintended consequences in the body, and everybody's physiology is different. So that's my problem with pharmacology is, again, if I get hit by a bus, please put me on some morphine, like take some of that pain away, and I'll deal with those unintended consequences later. But I'm not creating a lifestyle around it, because I could be doing damage that I have no idea. And that's why people who go on to antihypertensive meds typically complain about things like, they're complaining about headaches, they're complaining about dry mouth, they're complaining about fatigue, they're complaining about sleep issues, they're complaining about just all of these other symptoms that have now been created by the medication because it solved the one problem. And then their answer to it is, well, I'd rather live with those things than be dead. Well, I'd rather live with those things than being dead too. But what if there was an alternative where you didn't have to live with those things and you didn't have to be dead? Like, we talk as if this is a very binary decision, right? I either go on my medications or I die. It's like, that's just not the case. That's not the case. There's a plethora of options in there. And that's where I enjoy having a voice in the middle of that conversation to say, no, 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 no. There's alternatives. Your body was created by a designer who has created it with the ability to stay alive. Like, there are ways that if we understand the system in context of a system and not in the context of just a vacuum. Cardiovascular system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as a piece of a very large puzzle. And if we look at that in a more holistic approach, we're able to hack into its own ability to survive. And in doing such, I believe that we can get people to a healthier, happier, non-drugged life.
And like, most of the medication is based on natural plants that they've made a patent for, and then with the, like, most are petroleum based as well, so you're putting the toxins into your body. Yeah, it does solve one thing, but you're basically putting toxins into your body. And I love what your product is doing, because you're actually helping. But there's one thing that's actually very important, because because I know, unfortunately, a lot of people were pushed to actually take medication. They should be actually watching this, because the results, because I've seen a load of the reviews and everything, the results from the product, you need to be actually keeping track so that you're reducing the medication, but not on your own thought process. You actually have to probably liaise with your doctor for that.
That's correct. So as no different than if you were to go on blood pressure medications and lose a lot of weight. What ends up happening is your blood pressure medication is prescribed based on your weight. So if your weight goes down, you have to take less medication. Well, the same thing is happening here, and that is over time, usually using the Zona, we notice a result somewhere around 6 to 8 weeks. People really start noticing that impact. And it changes over time. And again, we don't make promises, and we'd never tell people to go off of their medication because your body has grown accustomed to that. What we believe is that if you're not taking medication yet and you're willing to try something more organic, try this first, because you may find that you don't ever need to be on the medications if you're able to get it under control. And the second thing is if you, to your point, if you are taking medication, then our recommendation is that you keep tracking your blood pressure, because if you start to resolve the problem naturally, you may find yourself over medicated because your blood pressure was naturally resting at 140, but now it's naturally resting at 125. They've prescribed you enough medications to take 15 points off that you don't need anymore. And what we find is people end up titrating off of the medications. And as you said, they need to liaise with the doctor to make sure that they're not over prescribed based on because they have a new benchmark, that there's a new waterline, and that needs to be considered.
I think it's like from the meditation podcast, somebody comes in and they say, oh, I've tried meditation once, it didn't work. And it's this, I think this is like that. Exactly. It's like eating, you eat every day. And I think with this as well, like you said you do it twice and you change hands for like 2 minutes, but I presume it's something that's continuous. You just don't do this for 2 months and then you park it away and that's it, you're done. It's like, it's just a form of life, I believe. Yeah.
What's interesting, and I actually make the comparison all the time to a treadmill, because we are FDA classified as an exercise device. So we're a class 1 exercise device that, and our classification says that with adjunctive use to, diet and healthy lifestyle, can be used to create cardiovascular health. So we don't make any medical claims. But to your point, like a treadmill, I can't use a treadmill one Thursday and be mad that I'm not in perfect physical condition, right? But also like a treadmill, that is, if I used it and got into good physical condition and then didn't use it for a short period of time, I don't fall out of physical conditioning either. As opposed to, for instance, if I forgot my blood pressure medication at home and I went on a trip for a week, I'm on holiday and now all of a sudden my blood pressure is going to spike because I don't have my medications, because the medication only controls today's problem. If I get my body into a state of health and homeostasis in my cardiovascular system, I don't have to worry about using my Zona every day or my blood pressure is going to go back up. That's not the way it works. People use it. As soon as they use the device, they don't notice anything the first time or second time. Over the course of a few weeks, your body becomes conditioned, and this cardiovascular dilation begins to become part of the norm. And then what happens is people start using it less, and then sometimes they'll stop using it for a month, and then they're like, oh, my blood pressure crept up a little bit. They go back, they use it, goes back down. It's the same like the treadmill, right? Like, oh, I put on a couple pounds. Great, go take them back off.
And I would assume there's none, but 2 questions here. Is there any side effect? Okay. And the other one is there an age limit? Like, is it okay for children to be doing this, or should you wait till you're 18 or 21?
Absolutely zero impact whatsoever, no side effects, and people of all ages can use the device. Typically, this type of hypertension that we find ourselves most effective on is actually related to age-related hypertension. As I mentioned, scientifically, that arteriosclerosis is normally an age-related thing. So we don't find a lot of young people using the device. Some people do for physical fitness. just because the device is like doing a 2-minute plank, right? So it's healthy regardless of your age. But we do get the question of what if I'm old and I can't grip very tightly? The answer is that doesn't matter, because in using the device, as I mentioned, it calibrates at the beginning of each session. So it actually asks you to squeeze it as hard as you can, and then it calibrates to what we refer to as your maximum voluntary contraction. So if you can only squeeze to 30 pounds of pressure, it calibrates to a person who can only squeeze to 30 pounds of pressure. If you can squeeze to 100 pounds of pressure, it calibrates to a person who squeezes 100 pounds of pressure. And today's exercise routine is calibrated based on how strong you are today. Because there are some days that I will use it and I'm very strong, and other days I just didn't sleep well the night before and I'm tired and I'm just not as strong as I was yesterday, and that happens. So it calibrates at the beginning of every single thing. Questions we get asked a lot is, how does it track it? And the answer is, it actually stores a year's worth of data right on the device. The device plugs right into your computer and all of that data can be uploaded. And it uploads and tracks all your performance. What have been your maximum voluntary contractions over time? It'll track how often you've used the device, which is great from a compliance standpoint when you go see your doctor, because your doctor says, "Oh, have you been using this?" And you're like, "Oh, I have." And then you look at the data, and it's like, "No, you have not." And then we also integrate with a digital dashboard that has a mobile app called Heads Up Health. And Heads Up Health is a dashboard that concatenates all sorts of wearable devices. You know, your Oura rings, your Fitbits, your Apple Watches, all of that data all can get pulled into a single dashboard where all of your health results can be listed at the same time. So that's Heads Up Health, headsuphealth.com. You can download that. And then that actually syncs with the device as well. And it keeps track of all of Zona's tracking measurements, and so you can have it right on your mobile phones. You can go right to your doctor and show your doctor how your exercise routine is going.
Brilliant. And is it battery operated, or is it a transformer that you just plug in and it charges it?
You just plug in and recharge it. Recharge it maybe once a week. You can use it every day, charge it once a week, and it actually keeps up. So no batteries, no additional costs. You just plug it in, let it recharge. It looks like, again, I wish I had one, but people can go to Zona.com.
It's like the Star Trek guns, basically, is what
right.
the old
Star Trek phasers.
Yeah.
That's the one that we get most often, is it looks like a Star Trek phaser. We also get that it looks like a scanner at the checkout line. So again, it's a grip, like a joystick that you would play a video game with, that's got a digital readout at the top.
Right. And just what's the lifespan? Because I mean, people need to start thinking as well. I mean, obviously it depends on each country, but the actual medication that they're paying for, I know in America a lot of it is kind of covered by insurance, but there's an excess. So if you actually take that away, I mean, I think it's after 6 months or less it's even covered for.
Yeah, most people will end up spending about $1,200 a year on hypertension medication, even with insurance, because there's co-pays and everything else. So the device itself retails at $599 US. We've got a Roy coupon, so you can save a few bucks that way. Coupon code ROY, ROY, will actually save $50 on the purchase. So with that, what ends up happening for us is people ask the question, well, how long does the device last? You know, what's the warranty and so on? And I laugh when people ask that question. I'm like, we literally build them so that you will crush them every morning. Like, the goal of the device is for you to crush it every day. There is no problem with maintenance. Like, we literally are asking you to squeeze it and crush it as hard as you can every single morning. Maintenance is not the problem. But it does have a 2-year warranty on it. If somebody does experience an electronic issue or something, they can just send it in. We fix it or replace it.
Okay, brilliant. And just because I do the Polish podcast, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Zona is żona in Polish. It means wife. So now you know that it actually
Oh,
means.
no kidding. That's a good thing. I like that detail better. Interesting fact. Years ago, we were getting a huge uptick in Eastern European website visits, and we couldn't figure out why we were getting so much Eastern European.
They're looking to buy a wife online.
Well, interestingly enough, we learned that Zona is the Yiddish slang for a prostitute. So they weren't necessarily looking for a wife online, Roy, but definitely for some companionship. So we had to start excluding some geographic regions from Google.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Just finally, because I love what you're doing, but I like I've read that you do some international humanitarian work, and you participated, and you also led relief teams worldwide. You might just tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so personally, I believe that I'm a fan of people doing well, but we also have to be doing good, and that is we need to be doing good things in the world. So through my church, actually, it's almost embarrassing that you mentioned that stuff, right? The Yeah, I've done a lot of humanitarian work throughout the world, and it is in multiple different states, but all throughout Eastern Europe, South America, Africa. Led humanitarian trips through multiple organizations, not just through my church, but through like Samaritan's Purse, and that kind of stuff. And those can be anything from disaster relief projects to building projects, construction projects, anything like that. It's been a blessing to be part of it, and I will tell you why. And I'll say this to your American audience as well as your international audience. And I will say that being a born American, I'm very proud of my country. I love my country, although I don't love everything about it. But I love my country. But one of the things I will say about Americans is we've got a very bad reputation internationally. And part of the reason behind that is simply because Americans, in too many cases, have grown up spoiled, and have grown up in a country that provides so much that they forget that the blessings that we have here in this country are blessings, exactly blessings. They're not entitlements. And unfortunately, too many Americans have come to believe that the things that they have here is their due. That is their entitlement, rather than they are just extraordinarily blessed, and they become greedy rather than grateful. And I will say that probably the greatest perspective change in my entire life has been the ability to travel internationally, be part of these types of teams. The first trip I ever took was to the country of Romania. And I had taken souvenir cash with me, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and I had taken money with me to buy souvenirs and things like that while I was traveling. And that was a lot of years ago, Roy, many years ago. And that was before the power of your cell phone going with you and everything else. And when I learned that I had as much money in my pocket for buying souvenirs as the people that I was staying with, we were actually assigned to stay in homes, and I was staying in the house as a guest of a gypsy family. And I had more money in my wallet than the father of that family earned in a year working at a glass factory. Like, I'm buying souvenirs with as much cash as this person literally earns in a year working in a factory where he's, boiling every day, I mean, the heat from a glass factory. And I'm like, my gosh, like, I mean, I literally couldn't do anything with that money. I just left it. Like, I can't in good conscience do this. And I think that changes perspective. And again, I'll say internationally, we tend to be very spoiled as Americans. And I think, when Americans travel, I've been to London, I've been to Paris, I've been to Rome, I've done the touristy hotspots throughout my life as well. But those don't give you perspective the way that, going to the desert of Kenya is going to give you perspective, and realize that other humans just don't have what we have. I hope that not a day I live in a beautiful city. I live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I wake up every morning in paradise. And I will say that my prayer on a daily basis is to never let that be lost on me.
Beautiful. Listen, Mark, thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I'd love to get you back on the speaking podcast because I'd like to talk about your book and your agency and everything, but it's not really for this one. But I'll just mention your book, Date Your Clients, and it's just for those that enjoy this conversation. But you might let people know how they can get in contact with you, Mark.
Oh, for sure. Obviously go to Zona.com for a medical device, not a wife. But if you go to Zona.com, Zona.com, you can check out the product. Use coupon code ROY, ROY, to save $50 on your purchase. If they want to get a hold of me, you can just email me at mark@Zona.com, and that goes right to my inbox. Nobody checks my mail for me, and I'll gladly reply.
Brilliant. Listen, thanks very much. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Roy. I've appreciated talking to you as well.
So that's all for the Awakening Podcast. You'll find all our episodes on awakeningpodcast.org. As mentioned, we're on BitChute, YouTube, and Rumble. And you will find my 4 other podcasts along with my coaching bio.link/podcaster. Sure to give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends. And when you get Mark's book, make sure you give him a 5-star rating as well. He's got 94, 95% 5-star rating. They all love it. There's lovely comments on it. So until next week, take care.